Well, dear guests, dear colleagues, dear students, it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce to you Justin Gest, Assistant Professor of Public Policy at George Mason University's Shaw School of Policy and Government. I do in fact think that we could not have a more interesting speaker in times when we sometimes rub our eyes in incredulity about phenomena like Trumpism, Brexit, or the rather unexpected turn to the right that we experience not only in European and US party systems, but also in the populace at large. The while comparisons tend to limp, the rise of populism and its demagogues that we're witnessing at least reminds one of similar phenomena in the 20s and 30s, where a combination of economic crisis and a weakening left led to a vacuum that made Antonio Gramsci revise the analysis of Marx in the light of the upsurge of a nationalist right that, against Marx's prediction, was soaking up what would seem to be the constituency of left-wing socialist parties, the working class, farmers, and small officials, that back then as nowadays feel themselves more and more disenfranchised and besieged by what they consider an alliance between a political class of experts and an increasing influx of foreign migrants, the latter of which seem to profit from a too generous distribution of welfare and financial support. What makes Professor Gest such an appropriate speaker is the fact that he has intensely researched and published on three interrelated spheres: that of increasingly dissatisfied minorities, that of a similarly disenchanted white working class, and that of immigration. In his first book, Apart, Alienated and Engaged Muslims in the West, came out in 2010, Gest studies Muslim political behavior in Western democracies. Taking as case studies the Moroccan immigrant community from Madrid and the Bangladeshi immigrants of London's East End, his research explores the origins of extremism and civic engagement among a stigmatized community of citizens. Applying a typology of active and passive alienation, he comes to the maybe counterintuitive but relevant conclusion that active adaptation to a guest culture might actually also lead to a higher degree of frustration and active resistance, and that the revised goals resulting from the adaptation are still likely to be shattered against the reality of lacking economic success and political recognition, potentially leading to an active resistance against the guest state. The logic, Gest argues, and I quote, is that integration fosters a sense of entitlement that predisposes the integrated to expect a more complete set of rights and liberties than the less integrated. The sense of injustice is therefore significantly more sensitive and disappointment more poignant among those with greater expectations, with a stronger sense of rejected national identity, but without much faith in the democratic system to remedy inequity. End of quote. Low expectancies, on the other hand, and so his research shows, might consequently lead to a more passive, indeed almost resigned attitude toward the guest culture. Both outlooks are, admittedly, rather bleak. His second book, The New Minority, White Working Class Politics in an Age of Immigration and Inequality, that appeared in 2016, examines the complicated marginality of white working class people in the United States and Britain, where they have been the backbone of movements to elect Donald Trump and leave the European Union. Extending and refining the sociological instruments developed in the prior book, Gest operates with interviews with and surveys of working class residents in contemporary Youngstown, Ohio, and the East London borough of Barking and Dagenham. The narrative that unfolds is one we are familiar with in the US, because the steel barons and their great works have vanished or have become transitionally invisible. Class consciousness has declined and been replaced by resentments against the more convenient, and that is racial element. It is a demographic narrative of decline in which the white working class is being replaced by a meritocratic class from above and an immigrant set of strivers from below, which in a nutshell is the definition of populism. And in a diagnosis that reminds one very strongly of the empty signifier that Ernesto MacLeod locates at the heart of any populist movement, Gest concludes that the majority group, which is defined primarily through their whiteness, is, and I quote, a negative space, an empty or unfulfilling ethno-racial option, end of quote. That is, as one reviewer succinctly puts it, the, quote, amorphous amalgam of multiple ethnic identities historically defined entirely through opposition as opposed to some internal content, end of quote. As time presses, let me just mention that his third book, The White Working Class, What Everyone Needs to Know, extends the basis of his prior book and provides an essential overview of political, sociological, psychological, and economic research on the politics of white working class people in the United States and Britain. The book explains what white working class means in terms of demographics, history, and geography, as well as the ways in which this group defines itself and has been defined by others. It addresses the question whether and why white identity is on the rise, why white people perceive themselves as marginalized, and the roles of racism and xenophobia in white consciousness. It also takes a look at whether the white working class has distinct political attitudes and voting behavior and its prospects for the future. His fourth book, which I take is forthcoming?
No, it just came out.
Oh, The Crossroads?
Crossroads. I brought a copy.
All right, great.
I can prove it.
Okay, we believe that. Crossroads, Comparative Immigration Regimes in a World of Demographic Change, that appeared with the Cambridge UP, is co-authored with Anna Boucher.
She's Australian.
All right.
So it's Boucher.
This work represents a systematic, comprehensive, and demographic data-driven taxonomy of migration regimes across 30 countries. It explores the question of what drives convergence and variation in immigration policy worldwide. Professor Gest's research has been published in journals including Citizenship Studies, Comparative Political Studies, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Global Governance, Global Policy, the International Migration Review, Migration Studies, Proceedings from the National Academy of Sciences, and the Review of Middle East Studies. He has also published commentary, analysis, or contributed reporting to a number of newspapers, including the Boston Globe, The Guardian, the Houston Chronicle, The Hill, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Politico, Reuters, and the St. Louis Dispatch. From 2010 to 2014, Professor Gest was a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at Harvard University's Departments of Government and Sociology. And in 2014, he received the Joseph R. Levinson Memorial Teaching Prize, Harvard's highest award for teaching. In 2013, he received the 2030 Star Family Prize for Student Advising, Harvard's highest award for student advising. As we are all collected here for both advice and teaching, I think there's a lot to look forward in his talk about the spiral of immigration and nationalism. Please welcome with me Professor Justin Gest.
Thank you. The ultimate insider in American politics, British politics, European politics, how can the ultimate insider feel on the outside? How can the central core of a society feel like they're on the periphery? Okay. The second question I'll address is whether white working class feelings of marginality, feeling like they are on the outside, whether this is simply old-fashioned racism. The third question will be about what is driving white working class people to the fringes of their society, to the radical right, to supporting far-right parties. And then the fourth question I'll address will be, how does all of this relate to immigration, both past immigration politics and policies, and what the future then holds for immigration and nationalism together? Okay? I will be adumbrating these subject matters, and so of course I suspect you'll have questions. I very much look forward to hearing them. Should you wish to have any clarifications, just let me know in the middle of the lecture. Otherwise, if you're looking for something a little bit broader after the lecture, I'm happy to take as many as I'm allowed to take, as many as time permits, yeah? All right. So let's begin with the first question. And but what I'll do, by the way, is I'll pass around these copies. These are my copies, so you can't have them. If one of them appears on eBay and it's in Bern, I'm going to know what happened. So, unfortunately, the first book is not in there. I didn't know you guys would be interested, but apparently Professor Clavier is, and I didn't bring it. But the other ones are here. So, the very first question. How can this group of people, white working class people, the group of people that seems like so much attention is on in European and North American politics today, how do they feel on the outside? What is the nature of this marginality? I argue that it comes in three different components. The first component, and I should clarify up front, that these components are perceptive. They are perspective-based. It doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean they're grounded in facts. It means that this is the way people feel. And for those of you who don't study politics on a regular basis, in politics, belief and perceptions are more powerful than fact and reality. So the first perception that really drives the sense of marginality is the sense that white people and white working class people are being outnumbered. Now many of you are probably thinking to yourself, wait, we just got started. White people make up 84% of Britain. They make up more than 80% of almost every European country. They make up 61% of the United States. 71% of American voters are white. How is this feeling even possible? The key to understanding it is in relativity. When your population was previously up around the 90s level, when your community was homogeneously white, a single ethnicity, a single Christian faith, and suddenly the smallest influx, or even a moderate influx of difference, makes you feel the relative loss of status. And so it doesn't necessarily matter that the majority is maintained. It is that there's a sense of loss of numbers in relative speaking. And so when you think about a town like Youngstown, Ohio, where I spent a good amount of time, about 3 months, doing my ethnographic fieldwork for Professor Clavier's introduction, this was a city that was 90% white and working class for a very long time. And with the decline of industrialization, the rise of the knowledge economy, the service sector, Youngstown eventually became 50% white and 50% non-white. That kind of change is disorienting socially, and so it had some effects. The second perception that's very powerful is a sense of externality. Many white working class people believe that they are on the outside looking in, that they don't have a seat at the boardroom table of businesses, at the legislative session of governments. They don't believe like that their views are heard. And it's interesting, if we look at some of the data on representation, take the United States Congress, for instance. My colleague from Duke University, Nick Carnes, is about to publish a book that finds 2% of the American Congress is of working class background, meaning low educational background. Now, it's not just white working class background. It's working class, so they could be Latino, they could be black, they could be Asian. 2%. This sense of exclusion from the power brokers, from the tables where decisions are made, has informed many white working class senses of marginality. The third perception is of discrimination. Many white working class people believe that they are discriminated against because they are white and because they are poor or low education. And if we think about it, terms like redneck, hick, hillbilly, white trash, maybe you guys have heard these before. In Britain, the word chav. In Australia, it's bogan. What is it in Switzerland? In one of the languages?
Appenzell.
So apparently you've heard that one before. Pretty much every language has a derogatory term for white people who are poor. And many white working class people believe that they lose out on jobs, educational places, access to housing, access to welfare, because they are white and poor. What's your excuse? People are thought to think. You have no disadvantages, you have no legacy of structural lack of privilege. What's your excuse for being poor or needy? And so, this sense of discrimination permeates the idea, the sort of frustrations that underpin many white working class people's sense that they are now the marginal group, that they are somehow in what we may otherwise have called a minority, even though, of course, they're not, when you think of it from an objective statistical perspective. So this brings me then to the second question. What about this, all this angst, this frustration, this sense of marginality? Is what we're really talking about simple, old-fashioned racism? Because many, particularly on the political left, would like you to think that that's what it is. It's simply a bunch of backward racists, and that's why they're so upset. I think it's a little bit more complicated. Racism is problematic as an explanation because it's quite subjective and it imposes a duality. Either you're a racist or you're not a racist. We've heard this before. But unfortunately, a lot of the views that inform white working class political sentiments are somewhere in the gray area in between, informed by considerations of race or hierarchy, perhaps informed by a sense of resentment for people of racial or ethnic differences, but not necessarily white supremacy. And so understanding that complexity is worth actually unpacking a little bit. So, with white working class people, the sense of racism often comes down to, actually the very word racism is often very problematic for white working class people. When I was out in Dagenham, which was one of those east boroughs of London, I became very sensitized to racism as an explanation because I was going through my interviews and almost about 24 of the people that I was interviewing would say to me, they would preface a statement to me by saying, now I'm not a racist, but ... yeah? And of course, in the back of my mind, I thought to myself, okay, here it comes, right? And sometimes it came. Sometimes very racist, very nasty things were said. But other times, something that was seemingly irrelevant came out of their mouths. And I started to ask myself, why is it that so many people feel it's necessary, they don't know me, why is it necessary to let me know, now I'm not a racist, before they're about to say something, even if it's irrelevant? And what I began to realize is that for white working class people, at least the ones that I was interviewing, the idea, the concept of racism is different than what it meant for me. For me, it's one of the most important social concepts of the 20th century. It alerts us to the double standards and implicit biases in the back of our minds. But for white working class people, racism is a muzzle used to silence you. Don't listen to her. She's a racist. What he says doesn't matter. Racist. White working class people understand racist as a means, an instrument of silence. It is what I refer to in the book The New Minority, a mute button. On your television remote, there's a little button that stops the volume, right? You click the racist button and suddenly, silence. For many white working class people, when Donald Trump and Nigel Farage in Britain and Marine Le Pen in France referred to the silent minority, or the silent majority, the silent majority, what they really were referring to was the silenced majority. That they had been silenced by a politically correct brigade of intellectuals, elites, that are using the politics of racism to disqualify what they have to say. And so when my subject said to me, Justin, I'm not a racist, but what they were actually saying to me was, listen to what I'm about to tell you, and don't disregard me. Now many of you are probably thinking to yourself, Justin, don't these people understand? There are these histories of colonialism and hierarchy and status and just structural advantages that white people benefit from. There are invisible wages of whiteness that you receive just on the basis of being white. Surely your subjects can understand that, right? There was a woman in Youngstown, Ohio, who said to me, I am one car accident, one unexpected medical bill from that trailer park, from extreme poverty. What privileges, what advantages are you talking about? For many white working class people, that privilege, that advantage built into societies is what the ocean is for fish. When you've been swimming in it all your life, you don't even know it's there. The third question, what drives white working class people to the far right? It's an interesting point that Professor Clavier makes about Gramsci and the working left shifting to the right with nationalism in the earlier 20th century. Because we have observed, of course, a very similar phenomenon recently. Much of the gains of the far right have come from what used to be the left. And it is perplexing to many how so many white working class people can put their interests to the side. Why are they voting against their own interests? People ask all the time, especially on the left. But what I want you to think about for a moment is what we mean by interests. When people say that people are voting against their interests, we're referring to their wallet, their back pocket. But interests are not always economic. Interests can be social. We would never say that someone like a very wealthy leftist like Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, George Soros, these are wealthy billionaires who are politically on the left. We would never say that they vote against their interests, would we? And yet they do. No, we would say, look at these enlightened people voting against their interests because of their social prerogatives and their principles. That is what white working class people are doing. They are setting aside perhaps their material interests, which they recognize, they're not stupid, in the bigger interest of their society that they feel is somehow under threat. Why? So, to answer this question, I was informed by my earlier work, apart, on Muslim political behavior. I was interested in studying white working class people. Many people always ask me, why did you do this in the first place? It was because I wanted to understand the principal antagonists of my immigrant subjects. I'm ultimately a scholar of immigration. That's my thing. People associate me with populism and white people and all that stuff, but really I'm a scholar of immigration, and I didn't think that we could understand immigration without understanding its opponents. And that's why I went to white working class people. But my hypothesis at the bottom of it all was that the marginality felt by my Muslim subjects, their alienation, was not actually all that different from the alienation of the white working class people I studied thereafter. I thought, well, what I found in the first book on Muslims was that those who were predisposed to radicalism, to radicalization, were those, as Professor Clavier kind of touched on, were those who had felt the largest gap between their sense of the way the world should be and the way the world is. This discrepancy between the world we experience and the world we think the way the world ought to be. The ought and the is. In political science and social science, we refer to this as relative deprivation. Something that goes contrary to your expectations. And I said, well, if it's true for Muslims, why wouldn't it be true for white working class people? But I was wrong. Partially. I never completely wrong. So it's the professor's rule, you're never completely wrong. Partially wrong. How was I wrong? I undertook surveys where I studied the perceptions of white working class people, nationally representative surveys in the United Kingdom and the United States. And I asked people, where do you see your wealth, your financial well-being today? And how was the wealth and well-being of financial well-being of people like you 30 years ago? How powerful are you today? How powerful politically were people like you 30 years ago? And I said people like you because some of my subjects were under 40. They didn't really remember what it was like. They weren't around 30 years ago. So they're listening to their parents and their grandparents. I wanted to touch on those perceptions, on those mythologies, those oral histories. And then I showed them actually a set of concentric circles, like a target, a bullseye. And I said, imagine this is a model of your society. And the people in the bullseye in the center are the most important, the most central, the most influential. And people on each ring outward matter less and less and less. Where are you? I asked. Where were people like you 30 years ago? Where are Muslims? Where are Latinos? Where are immigrants? Where are black people? And people would click or point, depending on the interface. And what I found was that it was not the difference between the way the world is today and the way the world should be that drove people to the radical right. Rather, it was the difference between the way the world is today and the way the world used to be. The deprivation felt by white working class people is a deprivation of nostalgia. White working class people are consumed by the past, consumed by a sense of loss. In some cases, lost wealth, but actually that turned out to be the least important. More prominently, by a sense of lost social status, and most powerfully, by a sense of lost political clout, lost political power. Their frustrations and their voting for the radical right is an attempt to regain control. They feel like they have lost control of the societies that they once defined. Let's move on to the final question. What is the role of immigration in all of this? Why is the radical right so tied to immigration? Well, first off, it's worth emphasizing that the reason why immigration is such a powerful issue, starting from nothing, is that immigration is ultimately about humanity. Because you're not moving money, you're not moving goods. We can do that in world society, world economy, largely uncontroversially, aside from the current trade war. What you can't move as easily are human beings. Because migration brings into question matters of equality. When someone comes into a new country, the question is, are they equal in their status to me? Do they have equal rights, equal opportunities, equal access, equal benefits, equal voice? And what does that mean for my place in my society? It leads to questions of who is that, and who am I, who are we, and who are we going to be together? Very difficult questions to answer. And sometimes the hardest question to answer is, who am I? The grasp for a sense of identity in European countries has been incredibly, incredibly tense. Despite the fact that these are countries of blood and heritage and earth, dating back centuries and millennia. And yet this is a complicated question, because identities necessarily exclude. Exclude who? Migration also calls into question things like national security, crime, welfare, jobs, everything from school, healthcare. All of these things matter. Why? Because migrants are ultimately human, and so the panoply of human issues becomes relevant. And so the controversies do not simply stop at the border, they just start at the border. So, up until around 2000, the year 2000, there was a time period just after the end of the Cold War, that kind of decade of the 90s, when it really was, what was going on at the time was this sort of let a thousand flowers blossom kind of attitude in the world of liberalism. And there was a liberal model and a liberal understanding of immigration. The Cold War had ended, the walls had come down, opened the gates, and let's see a global world evolve and emerge. With globalization, we will all gain, and we can mix people who were previously cut out with boundaries, man-made boundaries. And actually, one of the people who wrote really well about this, and quite extensively about this, is unfortunately not in the room right now, but he is at your university, if I'm not mistaken, and it's Christian Jopke. And Jopke wrote extensively about this along with Gary Friedman from the University of Texas. And they argued about this new liberal model that was taking place, and that effectively it would sort of domino into the future, and that we would see a more open world. My new research in the book Crossroads comes to a very different conclusion, with the benefit of 20 years hindsight. 20 years later, we undertook an analysis of demographic data across 30 of the most important immigration destinations worldwide. And what we looked at was not the laws. We looked at the numbers. How many people were coming in to different countries, on what kinds of visas were they coming in, and were they getting access to citizenship, to nationality. And what we find is that a very different kind of model emerges. This is not a model of liberalism. It's what we call the market model. The market model has three components. The first is that you see an enormous amount of temporary migration. Temporary migration is when your visa has an expiration date. You can come in, but for this amount of time, and then you're out. Or you can maybe renew it. But the point is that there's an expiration. Almost around 50% of the visas in the 30 countries that we studied, these 30 countries, it's basically the major destinations in the world that you can think of. So we're talking about all North American countries, Mexico, United States, Canada, Brazil, pretty much all of Western Europe, including Switzerland, East Asia, Japan, China, Singapore, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. We also include the Gulf, so Kuwait, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, all of these are included, 30 countries. And in these 30 countries, about 50% of the visas, more recently, are going towards temporary migrants. So you can only stay for so long. What we also find is that about 85%, 80 to 85% of all visas in these 30 countries are principally allocated for labor purposes. You are here to work. Now, of course, you can also have a family with you, but that they're designated for labor purposes, which matters politically. And when I say 80 to 85%, I mean temporary work visas, economic visas for high-skilled migrants, low-skilled migrants, entrepreneurial visas, all of these count. So you're here to work, it's a short period of time. The third component, a loss of citizenship. The average citizenship rate peaked in 2000 and dropped since then, back down to 1989 levels. So less and less citizenship, fewer people are getting citizenship. So these three components define the market model. You're here for a short period of time, you're here to work, you're not going to get to stay and get citizenship and the rights that come with it. What you are effectively seeing is the Uberization of immigration. Everyone's familiar with Uber? Switzerland has Uber? Or has it been banned by the taxi mafia? Okay, but you guys know what Uber is. All of these sharing economy apps and websites work the same way. You hire people for short periods of time, you hire them to work, then you get out of your life. Right? It is the Uberization of the labor market, and we are seeing the Uberization of immigration consequently. Why is this taking place? Well, market integration is certainly one factor, but the other two very much relate to the research that I've been just discussing. One is paranoia about Islam and the association of immigration with national security threats and terrorism, what many people in the United States have come to call crimmigration, the criminalization of immigration. But really, the factor that really connects us here is populism and white working class voters. There seems to be a desire that, faced with their own precarity in European and American societies, many white working class people and supporters of the far right want to make immigrants as precarious as they are. They don't gain anything from this, but it certainly makes them feel better. And the reason why is it is a politics of status. It is going back to those circles. Because when we go back to those circles, in the United Kingdom in particular, which I think is a good test of European politics, even though it's not necessarily predictive, those people who supported the United Kingdom Independence Party, the British National Party, the sort of Brexiteers, tended to see themselves on the outside of those circles when they used to be on the inside. But what's really powerful is that immigrants and Muslims had moved closer in while they were moving out. This, particularly I think in Europe, is a politics of displacement. And it taps into the politics of nostalgia and that sense of lost control. And when you do not see much of an economic or a political future for yourself, it is at least satisfying to know that socially you remain in the center. The risk in all of this is a spiral downward. Immigration, nationalism, immigration, nationalism, immigration, nationalism, before everyone loses. Because the debate comes down to this often. Who has had it worse? Who is more vulnerable? Who needs the most help? And in this kind of debate, nobody wins, everybody loses, and very few people listen. And I think if there's one thing to take away from this work, from my research, I hope at least, is the value of listening. Because that's ultimately what I do when I go in the field. You guys have seen me mostly talk. My favorite thing to do is to just go listen. When I presented the book, one of the first presentations I gave was at Cornell University in New York. And one of the younger students, as a freshman as they're called, the first years, approached me and said, I really want to learn about these white working class people. How can I like learn more? Where can I find them? You know, what newspaper can I read? You know, and I mean, aside from like Fox News or Breitbart in the United States, I said, just drive 20 miles in any direction you want, and go have a conversation. Because these politics about identity, because that's ultimately what's being debated, are so tense that we tend to close up and not want to even have these conversations. And so I think the most important thing we can do actually to learn more about these things, while I hope you do read the books, I also hope you go out and talk to people and listen as well. All right, I will now listen to your questions, and I look forward to hearing them. Thanks. Are there questions?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. And may I say that's the most fascinating thing was that you talked completely without a manuscript. I find as a performance that was very stupendous. So thank you for that as well. I have two questions, if I may. One is about gender, which you didn't mention, and sexism. And I imagine that sexism functions as a similar mute button as racism does, and I just wonder what is the relation between sexism and the strange phenomenon of women voting for Trump and all that. And my second question, or maybe it's partly an observation, my question is, did you look at also at the situation in Eastern Europe in particular, so the acts behind the Iron Curtain countries, because there, of course, these phenomena may be strongest in Europe. What I glean from not so much talking, also talking to people but reading about that is that a very similar, that the EU, or there's a very strong ambivalence about the EU. People want to join the EU for various reasons, for economic reasons, but also because they want to have this mobility for themselves and all these freedoms. But there is also a great aversion and fear of the EU, and very often, or sometimes it is said, actually that's very similar to, the EU is similar to the old Soviet Union. The old Soviet Union imposed certain things on us and destroyed our national identity. Now the EU comes and says, if you want our money, or if you want to begin negotiations for membership, what you need to do is equal rights for women, equal rights for gay marriage, etc. And this refugees and all that, and all of these are direct attacks against the society that the way we want to have it, and that we actually would like to have it now that the Soviet Union has.
Okay, these are excellent questions. So let's start with gender and sexism. So I actually think that that's a really important point that I do. I think that sexism acts very much like the same kind of way racism does as a mute button. So I think you're spot on. I think that the gender dynamic is actually is pretty fascinating. I do write a bit about this actually. So but the side of the gender dynamic I think that's most interesting is actually masculinity rather than femininity. Because what happens with a lot of the white working class families is historically they were in family situations where men had very stable jobs, usually in manufacturing or something related to manufacturing. The jobs were well paid, they were very reliable, they lasted a lifetime. You didn't necessarily need to get a university degree, there was no pressure to do so. And because they were well paid enough and stable enough, many wives didn't work. And so you basically had male breadwinners bringing home income, and wives designated to childcare. And in many of these families, that changed completely with economic change, because not only with the deindustrialization did the manufacturing jobs go away, men continued to work. But the difference is that the jobs that became more at a premium and more available were in the service sector, of course. And the service sector was typically associated with women, and women typically had better qualifications for those jobs in many parts of the United States and the United Kingdom. So what you had happening was women becoming the principal breadwinner, and in about 30% of families they are, and women returning to work as well, and men losing that sense of status inside the family. Where all this comes together with what we were just talking about is that white working class people had already, men in particular, had already felt a sense of economic loss, right? That they were making less money, okay? Political loss. Your unions have now dissolved or become weakened, and they don't have the same power. Now you've also lost social power, because as status, you see immigrants, somehow ascending past you, or getting access to the same, schools, places, and jobs that you wanted. Add to that, as the male, that the sense of domestic loss, domestic disorientation, and it's just like too much to bear. Where is the sense of status, right? Where is the sense of domestic status thereafter? The question that you raise is very interesting. It's one that many people think about, which is why did these women vote for Donald Trump in such numbers? Because about 40% of his supporters or something was women. So that's a significant number. You couldn't win without women. I mean, that's just a political fact. And same with Brexit. You saw Brexit. I mean, Brexit, you didn't have a sort of sexual assaulter at the top. But you did. But nevertheless, there was a sexist dynamic, I think, to the far right in any case. And I think what happens is twofold. In Youngstown, what I found was that many women voted with their husbands in mind. How many times can we say that about men voting with their wives in mind? That's a whole other subject matter, I suspect. But it was fascinating. They actually sympathized with their husbands. And their husbands really got behind Donald Trump. And I think they felt the same, not necessarily an obligation, but they wanted to support, and they thought that this candidate would actually make their lives better as a result. And it is this sense of bonding and solidarity that many people voted. But in any case, and in other cases, his history of sexual assault was politicized. And many actually just discarded it because they actually believed in the principles that he was espousing. I mean, I do think that women are the smarter sex, but they're not always smarter, and sometimes they're making the same decisions as men, and that's the bottom line. That we can't simply think because they're women that they're going to put their gender identity over their identity as being white, Christian, or American. And that's simply what happened, that gender identity was not as powerful as people imagined it would be. And in fact, there's a new book that just came out called Identity Crisis. It actually shows that gender identity was not actually a very important factor in people's support for Hillary Clinton. In many cases, among voters, where their gender identity was very important, among female voters, where their gender identity was very important, they were already going to vote for her anyway. There were very few voters for whom gender identity was important, but they didn't already vote democratically. They didn't already vote left. And so basically, Hillary was unable to cross the aisle into the Republican territory based on her femininity, because the female voters just didn't care that much. So I think those two things really relate. Eastern Europe, I really did not look very closely at it. I observe it from afar, but I really prefer not to speculate. I do think that the phenomena of populism is different in Eastern Europe as it is for Western Europe. I do think it's different. They have a different situation. They're newer EU accession countries. They're principally countries of emigration rather than immigration. All of these are very important factors, I think. The legacy of liberal democratic thought is not nearly as deep in their societies, and so their experiences with democracy are about the same as like a country like Tunisia in some cases. So it's really apples and oranges in some cases, and so I'm not really certain, but I know that it is different. Thanks. Actually,
yes.
do you want to come sit up here?
Yeah, I'm going to break my neck otherwise. It doesn't make any sense. All right.
I think your idea of racism as a means to silence the working class thought-provoking, but I'm not convinced, because it is also a means to silence political elite and free spirit in research. It silences the whole society, so there must be something else behind it, kind of a Protestant moralism, or I don't know. Rather the argument of like they're not educated is what specifically silenced the working class, I think. So, and my other point is a rather personal question. I think you're a public school boy or elite uni educated person, and I think these working class people probably experience you as somebody who comes from the outside. So do you think they really speak openly with you, or how do you win their trust?
Great questions, great questions. Okay. Yeah. When you said personal, you meant personal. So it's actually a very important question from a methods perspective, actually, in social science. It's a very important question. So first off, with regard to racism, I agree with you. I don't mean to say that it silences white working class people. It silences anyone. So, the left is trying to silence, Marine Le Pen when she's speaking, just, or Donald Trump, just as much as they're trying to silence the supporters. I think that that's the way it's interpreted. That's not to say that racism is somehow a bankrupt concept that we shouldn't use anymore. But what I am trying to advocate is that when we try to understand what people think, and when we're speaking to people, it is completely counterproductive to label them racists. What we should really be talking about is what is the source of their frustrations, right? And actually give language to it, a vernacular. Racism is this shortcut, we don't have to worry about it, it makes it simple, but it actually is unproductive. With regard to the personal question, so first off, I'll have you know that I went to state schools. So yeah, I went to Harvard, but I came from a really rough state school in Los Angeles. We had barbed wire fence, we had a metal detector in the front, it had a gang affiliation, it was Crips, in case you were wondering. So, it's a little rougher than it looks, okay? Now, I also didn't look like this when I was going to Youngstown, Ohio, and interviewing people. I combed my hair, but I didn't wear a tie and a collar, right? So, don't let appearances be too deceiving. I'm just trying to impress Professor Clavier. So, but nevertheless, what you're saying is real, because I'm going to them as a university researcher. right? So they know that I am educated, at least a sort of master's or a PhD level, and I'm going out there and I'm talking to them about these things, and they know I'm not from there. Youngstown, the first question is, what high school did you go to? It is so wary of outsiders, it's instantaneous. They knew I'm not from Youngstown, they probably knew I wasn't from Ohio, okay? That's the state that Youngstown is in. In Barking and Dagenham, I'm an automatic outsider because I have an American accent in Britain, right? And so they automatically hear that, they're like, you sound like those people in Hollywood, okay? So in the movies I'm watching. So it's already, I'm on the outside. But let me reassure you that I have two big advantages. One, I'm, at least from their perspective, white. I'm white enough, okay? And being male probably doesn't hurt, okay? Although half of my respondents were women. But I do think that being a white male did not hurt. And they don't know anything about religion or anything like that. So it's like, white male, good enough. The other thing that really matters, though, was precisely what you think is a disadvantage, my outsider status. By being an outsider when you're conducting social research, and when you're trying to get people to be very open and candid with you, and if you check out The New Minority, people are very open and candid. There's a lot of profanity, and there's a lot of nasty things being said. It is easier to get people to open up when they're not afraid of judgment. And because of my outsider status, they feel like they can actually be very open and frank with me, because there's no chance for it to circle back to them inside of their community, or inside of their job, or inside of their circles. And so actually, I think it was an enormous advantage. The other benefit of being an outsider in Britain, in particular, as an American, is that because I was not British, I was somehow disqualified from British class politics. In Britain, as is true, I think, in Switzerland and other European countries, you can tell people's class in Britain by the way they talk. Accents tell you everything you need to know in Britain. Okay? And I'm not sure if you guys have noticed the differences in the way people speak in Britain, but live there a little while and you'll hear it right away. Some people speak like the Queen, and some people talk like, I don't know, like a musician or something. It's very different. Okay? By not having either of those accents, by not being placeable as upper class or lower class or middle class, I am exempted from class politics. So that means they can feel very free talking trash about rich people, but also talking trash about immigrants or anyone else. And so I actually think it was liberating to be an outsider and an enormous advantage. And the same is true for my studies of Muslims. Muslim communities are very tight-knit in many cases. Specifically, the Bangladeshi community that I studied in London was very, very tight-knit. Everybody knew everybody. They were very unlikely to tell a Bangladeshi Muslim what they thought. They're not going to talk about sex, politics, gender, all of the kinds of subjects that I want, or Islam, all the subjects that I want to talk about, they're never going to talk with one of their uncles about. But with me coming in from the outside, especially as an American, let the gates open. No problem. Thanks. You should come to my old school sometime.
Since it relates to your first question, I'd like to ask you the question. I was at a conference in Prague dedicated to populism, and the problem that came up is that a lot of the so-called experts that deal with that problem have an enormous problem dealing with that problem, because there's always the danger to implicate the people who kind of fall into the trap of populism as simply stupid. And one of the areas where that works is exactly when we talk about interest, and people seem to act against their own best interest. But what their best interest should be is something that the experts define. We know better that you should actually vote left than right.
Yes.
So we have that aspect of stupidity more or less built into exactly that judgment already. And then I think that's kind of where I agree totally with you, is that this club of being right, and of being racist, that this is a silencer. And I've been wondering if it's not the case that the so-called experts, again, who deal with that problem, are actually kind of taking themselves out of the equation and saying, well, as long as we can identify you as racist, we don't have to deal with your problems. Because if we stamp you as racist, everything else, all the other problems, the other claims, the other deprivations that you mentioned, come basically or fall completely off when you have that stamp established. And say, you are a right-wing or a Nazi, I really don't care about how you grieve or possibly what possibly could be your grievances, since I identified you as exactly that. So it's a kind of a distancing mechanism. So first of all, you're too dumb to know what your real interests are, and they now interest me even less because I've identified you as racist. So it's kind of an entire package that leads to this distancing and to the almost incapability of these so-called experts to even talk with, let alone about, the people that are identified as populists, and the problem of populism as such.
Yeah, one of the most, so I started writing The New Minority in 2011, so it was right after I finished my work on Muslim political behavior. And I knew when I started writing it that it was going to be controversial. Even though some people think I didn't predict that like Trump would win or that Brexit was going to happen. I mean, Trump wasn't even running for office in 2011. He was on reality TV, and Brexit wasn't even a word in our vocabulary. So, one of the things I was most worried about as a scholar was that my book would be very controversial because I actually empathize with white working class people. The book takes a very empathetic view. Not that I sympathize with them. It's not that I agree with them. It's that I give voice to what they're saying and that I acknowledge it and I don't judge it. Many academics and elites feel the need to say, now I disagree with everything they say, but, and I don't do that. It's a sort of it's a sort of couching language that I don't really do. And so my fear was that people would think, oh, you're one of them. You're an alt-right guy. I didn't have to worry about that after Donald Trump was elected. The book came out 2 months before Trump was elected and 2 months after Brexit was voted upon. And so I didn't have to worry about that because suddenly people on the left wanted to read the book because they were like, what the hell just happened, and they were freaking out. But it was a concern. And I think that I'd like to think that our work and our research is more powerful when we do it without judgment, without actually imposing our own thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. You very much focused, I think, on the individual lost their sense of the loss of control, right, as you phrased it. And I was wondering, especially with a view on Britain, whether you think, or whether you've given this any thought, this sort of, to what extent this individual loss of control, the feeling of that, might interlink with on the national level, the sort of fear of the control, loss of control as a nation,
Yes.
and to what extent that is a very British discourse.
Yeah.
Because you spoke about, of course, the white working class, but of course Brexit has a lot of supporters, upper class people.
As is Trump.
Who then say, well, it's the loss of control of our nation. So how do these two go together? Do you have a few thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. I do have a few thoughts, actually. Comparing Britain and the United States, sometimes people conflate what I'm saying to suggest that they're very similar countries. Actually, they're very different, as you gather. And they have very different histories and very different sort of, ideas of sort of Gemeinschaft, if you will, right? So it's just a very different place to understand. But so let's just go through both, because I think they both have a sort of melancholia. Mm-hmm. In Britain, it's very much related, I think, to empire, right? And so there was this sense of centrality in the world, and that colonialism, the ideologies of colonialism and the racial hierarchies that it represented and sort of implicitly, subtly suggested later in its history, gave a sense of reassurance to Britain of its centrality. And I think that began the sort of, from Suez thereafter, if you really want to take the long view, from Suez thereafter, you saw a very steady denouement of British status in world affairs. And I think that many saw that their entrance into the European Union as a capitulation, right? That they were no longer strong enough to be on their own and isolated as an island nation, but that they had to actually rely upon the European Union. When, of course, if you ask me personally, it's like they had the sweetheart deal, right? The only country that has a better deal with the European Union is probably Switzerland, and maybe Norway. So, like they had a sweetheart deal where they get a lot of the benefits from the European Union with fewer of the obligations for a very long period of time. But nevertheless, it was the act of actually joining the Union that actually made them feel somehow dependent upon the rest of Europe, and that Britain had lost that strength. Similarly, the need to actually bring immigrants into the country, both to lend them a hand, to lend immigrants a hand because they're so vulnerable, it undermines white working classes' grievances or claims of vulnerability, but it also suggests that immigrants may be more qualified than them to take the jobs over and compete for them, etc. In the United States, it's a little different. What I actually found, Americans' confidence in their power on earth knows no bounds. It's really remarkable. What I actually found was more of a sense of isolationism that Trump tapped into perfectly. I mean, it's unclear how much, people often ask me, they're like, is this guy a genius? Did he do his homework in advance and realize that this is what people were thinking? The answer is no. He actually already thought those things, and he had been thinking them since the 1980s. That's why he's having trade wars, because that was popular in the 1980s. His ideas have stayed relatively static. They've simply come back into fashion, I think, in many ways. But he was able to tap into this isolationist feeling amongst people in the upper Midwest, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, the states that you often hear a lot about when it comes to Trump. And the reason why you had isolationism was that many of these white working class people and white people more broadly began to feel like the United States had been focusing so much of their resources and effort and attention outside the country, when what really needed the attention was right here, right? We need to focus on jobs, on education, on domestic issues, right? I mean, Clinton and Trump barely talked about international politics. Clinton did a very good job trying, I think, to actually direct attention to the sort of wild card of having the nuclear button, the red button next to his desk, but it really didn't stick. People were not that concerned because they just weren't focusing on foreign politics. They were focused on home. And so that really tapped into, I think, American sentiments about power, is that, sure, the US was all powerful, now it's time to start using our power and help our own. And hence the America First, yada yada.
Any question here?
Yeah, I just flipped through.
He's earned it because he's been standing the whole time.
In your book Crossroads, I just flipped through it before a little bit, and I saw that you classify immigrant regimes in extra-union, intra-union, and so forth. And on the other hand side, you did sort of perception studies, and you asked these people how they perceive their position in society, basically, as far as I understood it, the circle and everything. Could you draw some correlation between the two? Like, say, if there is, for example, a more liberal immigration regime, that, for example, locals will react more, angry, or disappointed, or more afraid of losing status?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I haven't actually done that yet. And since you have a copy of both books, you can actually ask that question, I guess, now. Maybe it's a question that's going to come up more now that the other one's out. I haven't thought about it. Just to give everyone a little bit of background, because they may not have read it as thoroughly as you just did. Crossroads takes that demographic data, it puts it into an algorithm. It's called a k-means clustering algorithm, which I can describe in more detail if you wish. But basically, it produces a typology. And it clumps together, clusters together countries that look alike in terms of their immigration demographics, and it separates the ones that look dissimilar. And so it creates 7 types of immigration regimes. And so the question for the gentleman in the back is whether we can correlate the immigration regime type with the sort of views on immigration. It's tough. It's tough. Here's why. In some countries which are particularly liberal in that they give a lot of citizenship, they naturalize a lot of people, they allow family immigrants and refugee immigrants, those countries Where the correlation really takes place is, I think, has to do with colonialism. Those countries tend to have a legacy of colonization. And it works two ways. You can be colonized, or you can be the colonizer. But both hold true. The colonized, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United States, tended to have more open policies in that they were letting more people in with more permanent visas and a higher rate of naturalization. One of the reasons why was that they had a lot of immigrants, but the other reason why is that they had a lot of immigrants because they wanted to settle disputed territory which they were stealing from indigenous people, right? So they're like, get these people citizenship quick so that they can build a house on the land that we're trying to take, right? And that's, I mean, I know it sounds funny when I say it that way, but that's literally what people were trying to do. They were settling occupied land. So immigration was a tool to do so. For the colonizer, what happened, it was actually a later in history situation, phenomenon, where countries like Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, to a limited extent maybe Belgium and the Netherlands, were experiencing immigration from the colonies into their societies, beginning in the 1960s mostly, 50s earliest, 60s in particular, and it basically flowed into the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And because of the colonial links, there was a sort of facilitated entry and admission into these societies. There was a period of time when Indians, people from the subcontinent, could enter Britain without a visa. They were all equal subjects of the British Empire, so it's like, well, if you could get here, fine, you can come in. You're all subjects of the kingdom. So those kinds of links basically led to, when the European countries needed labor, they went to their colonies first because there were linguistic ties, they all spoke the same language, there were sort of business ties, transfer ties, family ties, lots of things that brought them together. And so, because you were bringing these people over, they had higher rates of immigration, more family migration, more permanent migration, and more citizenship. As a result, those are also the countries where you are seeing the backlash, the populist backlash right now, France, Britain, United Kingdom, France, Britain, the United States. But you don't really see it in New Zealand or Canada. In Australia, it's latent right now. There is an Australia First party. I think it's called Australia First. That is emerging. It's not, I just can't say it's a correlation. Then there are the non-colonizing European countries, with some very small exceptions: Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, Switzerland. Non-colonizing states. I would probably say the same thing about Korea. Japan colonized but didn't experience immigration. These countries tend to be much more restrictive in who they're letting in, less immigration from third countries, more immigration from inside the European Union. And so they're a lot more closed. They don't have as much family migration, less refugee migration with the exception of Sweden and Finland and Norway. And so you see different politics emerging. So I would say it has less to do with the politics of populism and more to do with the politics of colonialism.
Okay. We had a question over there. I think that was the next.
I was just wondering if in your work you're starting to see possibly a big generational divide with how people view immigration. Both my parents are migrants to America well before I was born, and they don't have any secondary education. They're very much working class. They went on to become Trump supporters, which
Where are they
is a
from?
viewing different.
Where are they from?
My mother's Irish, and my dad is French Canadian.
I heard your Irish accent, and so I was thinking that.
I moved here from Ireland.
Okay, got it.
But we very much differ in our views. And I was one of the first in my family to get an education and work in higher education.
So Thanksgiving was awkward.
Yeah, and we had the Canadian.
Yeah, a lot of weird Christmas dinners in the United States the last couple of years.
Yeah, and but yeah, there's very much a generational divide in my own family, and I'm seeing a lot of my friends that are from America as well, who their parents aren't educated formally, and they go on to get a university education because it's much more accessible. And so I was wondering if that kind of affects your work, if you're seeing this view of, kind of racist, far-right views kind of dying out, but then also, how does that explain a lot of the youth movements like Identity Europa kind of coming up? in places like Austria now, it's moving, Sweden, and even it's coming to Ireland to try. And so, yeah, I was wondering if you see this as dying out or
Yeah.
it's kind of gaining momentum.
It's a great question. So in the United States, no. Generally speaking, you didn't see an enormous difference generationally between Trump voters and Hillary voters. What I do think you will see is that younger people in the United States have no choice but to grow up in a much more diverse country. So I have 2 children under 5 years old, and in their age cohort, they are no longer a majority by being from white parents. So they will go to schools, as long as I don't live in some like homogenous like suburb of America where you have like gates and everything, which I won't do, because I went to state schools, yeah. So I don't want them to turn out that way. So they will grow up very much exposed to this, to diversity, you know? And so it's going to be undeniable. And so maybe, you know, racism sets in. I really hope my kids aren't racist, but like, if it could happen, but it's just, there's going to be some appreciation for nuance. There's going to be a history of conversations, maybe boyfriends, girlfriends, etc., where they're interacting with people of color and of different religions and, you know, different social backgrounds. So I do think that that will take an effect. So if I'm putting out my crystal ball, I think that will have an effect in the United States. I also think it's going to have an effect in Europe. It's just not the same demographic transformation that you're seeing in the United States and Canada, which are set to be no longer the majority of white people around 2045, 2050, depending on how we understand whiteness. In Britain, I'm informed by the work of my colleague Rob Ford. Rob is at the University of Manchester, and he's done really the best statistical analyses on the Brexit vote, and he finds that absolutely 100% there is a generational gap. People who wanted Brexit were absolutely predominantly white, male, and older, and vice versa, the inverse for the other side. And so yes, there's definitely a generational gap there. But Brexit was not just about immigration, even though it was largely about immigration, it was also about the European Union. And so the sense of that post-colonial melancholia that, as Gilroy calls it, as I just referred to it, that's going to be much more poignant in an older generation who remembers Britain's status in the world. In Europe, these questions are more squarely about immigration. And while you do have those demographic effects taking place, they're not as large. And I think one thing that people have to understand is that Europe is farther and farther removed from the Holocaust. And that the memory of that period of time, the memory of the discrimination that took place and the sort of horrors of the war and the wars are a more distant memory for young people. And you have a lot of people who are tired of being apologetic about their national identity. And this is especially true, I think, in Germany, right? I mean, I have a lot of very close German friends, and they have friends that are like, why am I hiding my nationalism except, you know, when it's like World Cup time? And of course, in Russia, they had to hide their nationalism again. But, you know, generally speaking, that's when it comes out, every 4 years, you know, or maybe when for the UEFA Cup or something. But generally speaking, it's reserved. And I think that there is a sense of distance from that past and a desire to become more nationalistic, and that can come out amongst younger generations too.
Yes, in the back.
Oh, thank you. Because Austria has come up a couple times before, because you mentioned it. Maybe I can talk from my own experience because I'm Austrian. I've been back to visit my family in April and in June, and what we're experiencing right now, yet again, is overt racism in the streets. It wasn't that apparent like maybe 5 years ago, and I've been living in Switzerland for maybe like a year and a half now. And because of the distance, I notice this now, but people are being bullied in the streets, especially veiled women. And a friend and I, we would witness this, and we're like, you know what? Let's do what left-wing academics usually don't do. Listen to those people.
Mm-hmm. So
we'd sit down, have a beer, maybe have a cigarette, and it was like, okay, because we're interested. It's exactly what you stated before. And everything that you just said before, it was nostalgia, it was what once was, what used to be. Also what you mentioned before, oh, women are taking away the masculinity. Women are taking away what we once did. You know, we brought home the bacon. I mean, there is a lot of profanity, and I don't want to repeat it right now. But the thing is, I think we have become so ignorant, because what we should really do is listen to those people and understand where it comes from. And then, you know, we were sitting there, it's like, okay, so what would be the verdict of what we have heard? And we've come to the conclusion, it's greed. It's people think that they work hard for something and someone just comes into the country and takes it away from them. They get health insurance, they have all the benefits, like social benefits, and they just don't understand why someone would come in and have the same benefits when they don't have to work for it. And that is a huge issue. And of course we also know, you know, the past of Austria. So I don't know if we should actually drag this into the discussion.
Well, my question for you is what, and this is a personal interest, and I don't know the answer, what is the past that those gentlemen were advocating for? What is the past that they miss? What are they yearning for?
See, that is not entirely clear because they were always referring to, oh, it used to, you know, there used to be better times when things were in order. Like, for instance, men would do this, women would do that. There wasn't so much immigration. It's like we had to work hard for what we have, and nowadays people come into the country and they don't have to do anything and they just get the benefits.
So this is great. Thanks so much for sharing that story. So this is really, you know, it's interesting and it's obviously validating. But what's really important about what you're saying is the inability to define what that past was.
Yeah.
Okay? Because that is true, I think, quite universally. There is this sense of the past being better, that there's this golden era for white working class people or just for the nation as in general, and that we have somehow drifted from that past. And if we could just revert. In Barking and Dagenham, the local council did a survey, unscientific survey, it would never get published, but it was a survey of the local residents, and they asked people, open field, what can we do to make Barking and Dagenham better for you? 50% of the respondents wrote, make it the way it was 50 years ago. Imagine being a council bureaucrat and being like, what the hell do I do with this? You know? I mean, it's very tough, but what it was about 50 years ago, you talk to different people and it's really not clear, right? Do you really want to go back to, you know, the horrors of industrialization? And I mean, you know, these manufacturing economies were not great in many ways. You know, yes, you had better wages, and do women really want to have sort of suppression and sort of role-defining situations? You know, do we really want to have like full-on like discrimination? It's really questionable. But the point is that it doesn't matter. This is about perceptions, right, versus reality. And there is this vague sense that things were better. I think that a lot of it comes down to race. You know, this is just my personal hypothesis. It comes out in new work from, I mentioned that book, Identity Crisis. What the principal finding, it's only in the United States. It's an American politics book. And if anyone wants to check it out, it's just coming out now. It's like coming out like in a week. It's by Sides, Tesler, and Vavrick. And the principal finding is that underlying the support for Donald Trump, particularly people who voted for Obama previously and switched, was racial resentment and a desire to end all immigration, or at least to curtail immigration. I think that the loss of control is about the control of the country they once knew. They used to think it was more homogenous. But what's really problematic, of course, is that there was immigration in the past too. You know, the United States, the old immigrants looked a little bit more like me, right? They were Italian, they were Catholics, they were Irish, they were Jewish, maybe they were Lebanese. They were different, but they were not necessarily brown. You know, they were not necessarily Latino, they were not necessarily Asian, they were not necessarily Muslim. And yet we got over it, basically, through a redefinition of what it means to be white, and also what a redefinition of what it means to be American. But it is that sense of sort of vague nostalgia that's so powerful, and it's not always rational in terms of how people understand it.
But sorry to end, but we also have this problem of Islamophobia, because people who argue like, oh, women are taking away, you know, our jobs and we're emancipated, but they're also arguing like, oh, if we have people coming from a different religion, you know, like for instance, veiled women, they're going to take away women's rights completely, which of course, you know, doesn't make sense. So it's also being afraid of terrorism and taking away women's rights, but then also arguing from the other stance, which doesn't make sense. So there are two things. It's exactly what you said, and then what you said before. It's like kind of a criminalization. You're afraid of like, criminalization. So
Crimmigration.
Crimmigration. Thank you. So that's what I wanted to add.
Cool. Thanks.
I would say we take two more questions over here.
Yes, thank you. So I'm from the old industrial heartlands of.
That's a
the
northern
UK.
accent, if anyone's
It's a
wondering.
Midland.
It's north of London, which
So
means
yeah,
north.
working class neighbourhood, and so throughout the 50s and the 60s and the 70s there were.
Liverpool?
God no.
Oh, okay.
But thanks for insulting me. Wolverhampton.
Okay.
So.
Oh yeah, that's a what I call a post-traumatic city. The class of cities.
That's where the Industrial Revolution started.
Yes.
So there were masses of immigration throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, huge racial problems. But by the time I was at school in 70s and 80s, actually I was with the kids of those first immigrants. It was 50% white. It was a really good mix. It was integrated. It was normal. You know, we lived on the same street together. Everything was fine by then. So my question is, surely it's a cycle that's going through, but maybe without the economic clout, right? Because there were jobs for everyone back then. But are we just at the top of that cycle?
Yeah, I think there is a cycle to it. I'm going to reference a semi-popular theatre production from the National Theatre in London.
Mm-hmm.
It was a show called England People Very Nice. Have you ever heard of it?
No, because they're not.
Yeah. So England People Very Nice, and it was a profane. It was hilarious. It was a great play. But what it does is it's set in the East End, and it goes through 4 acts.
Mm-hmm.
The first act is when the French Huguenots came in, right? And when the French Huguenots came to Britain, yeah, they were white, yeah, they were Protestant, but they were French, you know? And so the racism was against the French.
Mm-hmm.
And everything always takes place at the same pub. And there's, this bartender that's pouring pints for people, and the bartender was English, and he was lamenting about the frogs, okay? The next act, it's a Huguenot bartender, right? And he's lamenting about the Irish, right? So, he's crying out about the mix, okay? Then the third act is an Irish bartender who is complaining, and of course the Irish were problematic because, yeah, they were white, sure they were Christian, but they were Catholics. Okay. Then it's an Irish bartender complaining about the Jews, effing yids, pouring pints. Okay. And then it's a Jew behind the bar lamenting about the Muslims and the Bangladeshis who are coming into the East End, damn Pakis, And basically each act goes through the same thing.
Yeah.
The question is who's next? I don't know. Maybe Somalis, aliens. I don't know. It's unclear who's coming to Britain next. But yes, I do think that there is a cycle. But I also think that there is a redefinition of identity that has to take place in there somewhere.
Okay.
Like it's impossible for the cycles to emerge without a new understanding of who the we is. And I think that that's what sort of feels so distant from our politics right now, is that there's very little desire or attempts being made to reimagine, who we are.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have one question. This understanding, I think, is very important, and I always thought that it's a task of social science to learn to understand and not to judge. But how do we come from the understanding? What comes next? How do we come from the understanding to this reformulation of identity?
Well, I don't think that it's the job, and this is a very American. I'm sorry?
The $1 million question.
Yeah, but I'm sort of going to punt. So this may be the American academic in me, I don't know, but I don't think it's our job as social scientists to really develop that. I think that is, our job is to, in my mind, is to hold a mirror to society, right? I want to hold a mirror up so that people can see and understand what's going on, right? I'm not trying to distort that mirror or trying to exploit it. I think that the next step from the empathy, from listening, etc., I think it's inference. And that's ultimately my goal, is I'm trying to infer an understanding about social and political affairs from that work, from that research. The question of, okay, now how do we respond politically is really for people down the street, in Parliament, in the Bundeshaus, right? It's not for someone like me to do. Obviously, if they want to consult me, I'm very happy to share my views. But I do think that that's not really what we're here to do. And so I don't feel as much pressure to do that, but I can tell you that I am actively thinking about what's next, and that's why my books tend to be reasonably contemporarily relevant, is because I'm frequently thinking about, okay, what is the next move politically that I can somehow shine some light on to make people understand things more clearly. And for me, the idea of a majority-minority society is enormously large, and so my future work will be focusing on what is the effect of a demographic transformation in people's conception of the nation, but also how they react politically. And so, with that book, when that stuff is done, and it's early days now, but I hope to be able to start to answer these kinds of questions, but again, in a way using inference and research rather than advocacy.
Okay, thank you very much for a great Q&A session and for a great talk. Deserve this session.
Pleasure.
Small word, please.
Hi, I'm Tanya, and I have some good news for you. In the name of Stefan Scheitzko, who is at the conference, and the other members of the Forschungsplattform Migration, the network for migration studies at the Bernjamin and Kolleg, I would like to invite you for a little treat. There will be some nibbles and some wine just outside, so this is a good opportunity to continue our discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.